Welcome to Natu Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. From a Native Daughter, Colonialism and Sovereignty in Hawaii, by Haunani-Kay Trask. Part 3, The Colonial Front, Historians, Anthropologists, and the Tourist Industry. From a Native Daughter. Edno ivali mai no ka haole a ole e pauna hana Hawaii miloa. Let the haole freely research us in detail, but the doings of deep-delving Hawaii will not be exhausted. Kepelino, 19th century Hawaiian historian. When I was young, the story of my people was told twice. Once by my parents, then again by my school teachers. From my ohana family, I learned about the life of the old ones. How they fished and planted by the moon, shared all the fruits of their labors, especially their children, danced in great numbers for long hours, and honored the unity of their world in intricate genealogical chants. My mother said Hawaiians had sailed over thousands of miles to make their home in these sacred islands. And they had flourished until the coming of the haole, whites. At school, I learned that the, quote, pagan Hawaiians, end quote, did not read or write, were lustful cannibals, traded in slaves, and could not sing. Captain Cook had, quote, discovered, end quote, Hawaii, and the ungrateful Hawaiians had killed him. In revenge, the Christian god had cursed the Hawaiians with disease and death. I learned the first of these stories from speaking with my mother and father. I learned the second from books. By the time I left for college, the books had won out over my parents, especially since I spent 4 long years in a missionary boarding school called the Kamehameha Schools for Hawaiian Children. When I went away, I understood the world as a place and a feeling divided in two. One haole, white, and the other Kanaka, native. When I returned 10 years later with a PhD, the division was sharper, the lack of connection more painful. There was the world that we lived in, my ancestors, my family, and my people, and then there was the world historians described. This world, they had written, was the truth. A primitive group, Hawaiians had been ruled by bloodthirsty priests and despotic kings who owned all the land and kept our people in feudal subjugation. The chiefs were cruel, the people poor. But this was not the story my mother told me. No one had owned the land before the haole came. Everyone could fish and plant, except during sacred periods, and the chiefs were good and loved their people. Was my mother confused? What did our kupuna elders say? They replied, did these historians, all haole, know the language? Did they understand the chants? How long had they lived among our people? Whose stories had they heard? None of the historians had ever learned our mother tongue. They had all been content to read what Europeans and Americans had written. But why did the scholars, presumably well-trained and thoughtful, neglect our language? Not merely a passageway to knowledge, language is a form of knowing by itself. A people's way of thinking and feeling is revealed through its music. I sensed the answer without needing to answer. From years of living in a divided world, I knew the historian's judgment. There is no value in things Hawaiian. All value comes from things haole. Historians, I realized, were very like missionaries. They were a part of the colonizing horde. One group colonized the spirit, the other the mind. Frantz Fanon had been right, but not just about Africans. He had been right about the bondage of my own people. Quote, by a kind of perverted logic, colonialism turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it, end quote. The first step in the colonizing process, Fanon had written, was the deculturation of a people. What better way to take our culture than to remake our image? A rich historical past became small and ignorant in the hands of Westerners. And we suffered a damaged sense of people and culture because of the distortion. Burdened by a linear, progressive conception of history, and by an assumption that Euro-American culture flourishes at the upper end of that progression, Westerners have told the history of Hawaii as an inevitable, if occasionally bittersweet, triumph of Western ways over, quote, primitive and, quote, Hawaiian ways. A few authors, the most sympathetic, have recorded with deep-felt sorrow the passing of our people. But in the end, we are repeatedly told, such an eclipse was for the best. Obviously, it was best for Westerners, not for our dying multitudes. This is why the historian's mission has been to justify our passing by celebrating Western dominance. Fanon would have called this missionizing, intellectual colonization. And it is clearest in the historian's insistence that pre-Haole Hawaiian land tenure was, quote, feudal, end quote, a term that is now applied, without question, in every monograph, in every schoolbook, and in every tour guide description of my people's history. From the earliest days of Western contact, my people told their guests that no one owned the land. The land, like the air and the sea, was for all to use and share as their birthright. Our chiefs were stewards of the land. They could not own or privately possess the land any more than they could sell it. But the Haole insisted on characterizing our chiefs as feudal landlords and our people as serfs. Thus, a European term that described a European practice founded on a European concept of private land tenure, feudalism, was imposed upon a people halfway around the world from Europe and vastly different from her in every conceivable way. More than betraying an ignorance of Hawaiian culture and history, however, this representation was malevolent in design. By inventing feudalism in ancient Hawaii, Western scholars quickly transformed a spiritually based, self-sufficient economic system of land use and occupancy into an oppressive, medieval European practice of divine right ownership, with the common people tied like serfs to their land. By claiming that a Pacific people lived under a European system, that the Hawaiians lived under feudalism, Westerners could then degrade a successful system of shared land use with a pejorative and inaccurate Western term. Land tenure changes instituted by Americans and in line with current Western notions of private property were then made to appear beneficial to our people. But in practice, such changes benefited the Haole, who alienated Hawaiians from their land, taking it for themselves. The prelude to this land alienation was the great dying of the people. Barely half a century after contact with the West, our people had declined in number by 80%. Disease and death were rampant. The sandalwood forests had been stripped bare for international commerce between England and China. The missionaries had insinuated themselves everywhere. And a debt-ridden Hawaiian king, there had been no king before Western contact, succumbed to enormous pressure from the Americans and followed their schemes for dividing up the land. This is how private property land tenure entered Hawaii. The common people, driven from their birthright, received less than 1% of the land. They starved while huge Haole-owned sugar plantations thrived. And what had the historians said? They had said that the Americans, quote, liberated, end quote, the Hawaiians from an oppressive, quote, feudal, end quote, system. By inventing a false feudal past, the historians justify, and become complicitous in, massive American theft. Is there, quote, evidence, end quote, as historians call it, for traditional Hawaiian concepts of land use? The evidence is in the sayings of my people and in the words they wrote more than a century ago, much of which has been translated. Historians, however, have chosen to ignore any references here to shared land use. But there is incontrovertible evidence in the very structure of the Hawaiian language. If the historians had bothered to learn our language, as any American historian of France would learn French, they would have discovered that we show possession in two ways. through the use of an a possessive, which reveals acquired status, and through the use of an o possessive, which denotes inherent status. My body, ko'ukino, and my parents, ko'umakua, for example, take the o form. Most material objects, such as food, ka'umea'ai, take the a form. But land, like one's body and one's parents, takes the o possessive, ko'uaina. Thus, in our way of speaking, land is inherent to the people. It is like our bodies and our parents. The people cannot exist without the land, and the land cannot exist without the people. Every major historian of Hawaii has been mistaken about Hawaiian land tenure. The chiefs did not own the land. They could not own the land. My mother was right, and the Haole historians were wrong. If they had studied our language, they would have known that no one owned the land. But was their failing merely ignorance, or simple ethnocentric bias? No, I did not believe them to be so benign. As I read on, a pattern emerged in their writing. Our ways were inferior to those of the West, to those of the historian's own culture. We were, quote, less developed, end quote, or, quote, immature, end quote, or, quote, authoritarian, end quote. In some tellings, we were much worse. Thus, Gavin Dawes, the most famed modern historian of Hawaii, had continued a tradition established earlier by missionaries Hiram Bingham and Sheldon Dibble, by referring to the old ones as, quote, thieves, end quote, and, quote, savages, end quote, who regularly practiced infanticide and who, in contrast to the, quote, civilized, end quote, whites, preferred, quote, lewd dancing, end quote, to work. Ralph Kui Kendall, long considered the most thorough, if also the most boring of historians of Hawaii, sustained another fiction, that my ancestors owned slaves, the outcast kauwa. This opinion, as well as the description of Hawaiian land tenure as feudal, had been supported by respected sociologist Andrew Lind. Finally, nearly all historians had refused to accept our genealogical dating of AD 400 or earlier for our arrival from the South Pacific. They had, instead, claimed that our earliest appearance in Hawaii could only be traced to AD 1100. Thus, at least 700 years of our history were repudiated by, quote, superior, end quote, Western scholarship. Only recently have archaeological data confirmed what Hawaiians had said these many centuries. Suddenly, the entire sweep of our written history was clear to me. I was reading the West's view of itself through the degradation of my own past. When historians wrote that the king owned the land, and the common people were bound to it, they were saying that ownership was the only way human beings in their world could relate to the land. And in that relationship, some one person had to control both the land and the interaction between humans. And when they said that our chiefs were despotic, they were telling of their own society, where hierarchy always resulted in domination. Thus, any authority or elder was automatically suspected of tyranny. And when they wrote that Hawaiians were lazy, they meant that work must be continuous and ever a burden. And when they wrote that we were promiscuous, they meant that lovemaking in the Christian West was a sin. And when they wrote that we were racist because we preferred our own ways to theirs, they meant that their culture needed to dominate other cultures. And when they wrote that we were superstitious, believing in the mana of nature and people, they meant that the West had long since lost a deep spiritual and cultural connection with the earth. And when they wrote that Hawaiians were, quote, primitive, end quote, in their grief over the passing of loved ones, they meant that the West grieves for the living who do not walk among their ancestors. For so long, more than half my life, I had misunderstood this written record, thinking it described my own people. But my history was nowhere present, for we had not written. We had chanted and sailed and fished and built and prayed, and we had told stories through the great bloodlines of memory, genealogy. To know my history, I had to put away my books and return to the land. I had to plant taro in the earth before I could understand the inseparable bond between people and Aina. I had to feel again the spirit of nature and take gifts of plants and fish to the ancient altars. I had to begin to speak my language with our elders and leave long silences for wisdom to grow. But before anything else, I had to learn the language like a lover, so that I could rock within her and lay at night in her dreaming arms. There was nothing in my schooling that had told me of this, or hinted that somewhere there was a longer, older story of origins, of the flowing of songs out to the great but distant sea. Only my parents' voices, over and over, spoke to me of a Hawaiian world, while the books spoke from a different world, a Western world. And yet, Hawaiians are not of the West. We are of Hawaii, this world where I live, this place, this culture, this Aina. What can I say, then, to Western historians of my place and people? Let me answer with a story. A while ago, I was asked to share a panel on the American overthrow of our government in 1893. The other panelists were all haole. But one was a haole historian from the mainland who had just published a book on what he called the American anti-imperialists. He and I met briefly in preparation for the panel. I asked him if he knew the language. He said no. I asked him if he knew the record of opposition to our annexation to America. He said there was no real evidence for it, just comments here and there. I told him he did not understand, and that at the panel I would share this evidence. When we met in public and spoke, I said this. There is a song much loved by our people. It was written after Hawaii had been invaded and occupied by American Marines. Addressed to our dethroned queen, it was written in 1893, and tells of Hawaiian love of our homeland, as well as our feelings against our annexation to the United States. Famous are the children of Hawaii, who cling steadfastly to the land. Comes the evil-hearted with a document greedy for plunder. Hawaii, island of Keawe, answers. The bays of Pi'ilani, of Maui, Molokai, and Lanai help. Kauai of Mānoa sis, firmly together with the sands of Kakuhihewa. Do not put the signature on the paper of the enemy. Annexation is wicked sale of the civil rights of the Hawaiian people. We do not value the government's sums of money. We are satisfied with the stones, astonishing food of the land. We support Liliuokalani, who has earned the right to the land. She will be crowned again. The story is told of the people who love the land. This song, I said, continues to be sung with great dignity at Hawaiian political gatherings, for our people still share the feelings of anger and protest that it conveys. But our guest, the haole historian, answered that this song, although beautiful, was not evidence of either opposition or of imperialism from a Hawaiian perspective. Many Hawaiians in the audience were shocked at his remarks, but, in hindsight, I think they were predictable. They are the standard response of the haole historian who has no respect for native memory. Finally, I proceeded to relate a personal story, thinking that surely such a tale could not want for authenticity, since I myself was relating it. My tutu, grandmother, had told my mother, who had told me, that at the time of the overthrow, a great wailing went up throughout the islands, a wailing of weeks, a wailing of impenetrable grief, a wailing of death. But he remarked again, this, too, is not evidence. And so, history goes on, written in long volumes by foreign people. Whole libraries begin to form, book upon book, shelf upon shelf. At the same time, the stories go on, generation to generation, family to family. Which history do Western historians desire to know? Is it to be a tale of writings by their own countrymen? Individuals convinced of their, quote, unique, end quote, capacity for analysis, looking at us with Western eyes, thinking about us within Western philosophical contexts, categorizing us by Western indices, judging us by Judeo-Christian morals, exhorting us to capitalist achievements, and finally, leaving us an authoritative because Western record of their complete misunderstanding? All this has been done already. Not merely a few times, but many times. And still, every year, there appear new and eager faces to take up the same telling, as if the West must continue, implacably, with the din of its own disbelief. But there is, as there always has been, another possibility. If it is truly our history Western historians desire to know, they must put down their books and take up our practices. First, of course, the language, but later, the people, the aina, the stories. Above all, in the end, the stories. Historians must listen. They must hear the generational connections, the reservoir of sound and meanings. They must come, as American Indians suggested long ago, to understand the land. Not in the Western way, but in the indigenous way, the way of living within and protecting the bond between people and aina. The bond is cultural, and it can be understood only culturally. But because the West has lost any cultural understanding of the bond between the people and land, it is not possible to know this connection through Western culture. This means that the history of indigenous people cannot be written from within Western culture. Such a story is merely the West's story of itself. Our story remains unwritten. It rests within the culture, which is inseparable from the land. To know this is to know our history. To write this is to write of the land and the people who are born from her. What do you mean, we, white man? On a recent Saturday night, I watched a 1932 film, The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff. The movie opens in Egypt, where two British archaeologists and a non-native believer in what is described as the, quote, Egyptian occult, end quote, are debating whether to open an unearthed treasure, some 3,700 years old. Engraved with a death curse, the artifact troubles the occult believer, who argues against its opening to the senior archaeologist. The two discuss the issue outside the tomb, leaving a junior archaeologist within. The believer of the, quote, Egyptian occult, end quote, states the native case, once removed, that any disturbance will anger the gods, who must surely take their just revenge. The senior archaeologist replies that, quote, in the interest of science, end quote, the discovery must be investigated. Even if he subscribed to Egyptian beliefs, he says, he would not allow them to deter the progress of his work. His friend issues a final warning, then departs in fear. During their discussion, the eager junior archaeologist has opened the box, withdrawn a mysterious scroll, and begun to translate it, thus awakening our friend, Boris Karloff, long asleep in his mummy case standing uncovered against the tomb wall. As Karloff makes off with the scroll, the junior archaeologist succumbs to the ancient curse, laughing idiotically, forever lost to insanity. I, of course, cheered on this turn of events. But alas, Native Hawaiians do not, as far as I know, possess anything so powerful and immediate as the curse of the Egyptian gods to threaten those who disinter our cultural remains. In other respects, however, we are remarkably similar to the Egyptians. Like Egypt, Hawaii is part of a white colonial empire. Hawaiian culture and people are dominated by a long-distance power, the United States of America, whose settlers flood our land. We are fair game for tourists, adventurers, politicians, and, of course, purveyors of intellectual colonialism, including historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists. Our culture is seen, as is Egyptian culture in the film, to be foreign, pre-scientific, and representative of the threatening because potentially uncontrollable unknown. Most important, Hawaiians, like Egyptians, are those being disinterred, studied, and removed to museums. The entire subject of the film assumes the power of the British colonizers to control the Egyptian colonized, just as the practice of archaeology in Hawaii assumes the power of foreigners to dig up and study our remains. Hawaiians, like Egyptians, are but the backdrop for history. We do not make our own history, we merely watch as others concoct a history for us. The film's racist assumptions, like the assumptions of archaeology and anthropology in Hawaii, are clear. These natives are not real people, meaning white people, who have a real culture, meaning European culture, deserving of the kind of respect that operates between equals. Therefore, native customs and beliefs are of little consequence. They cannot be seriously compared to, quote, scientific, end quote, concerns, nor can they limit or direct, not to mention stop altogether, the work of, quote, scientists, end quote. The attraction of the film for Euro-American audiences is that native resistance, in the form of the mummy, will pit the feared, colonized world of the, quote, occult, end quote, Egyptians against the safe, rational world of the, quote, scientific, end quote, British. The fantasy life of the colonizers will be satisfied while their worst fears are laid to rest. The mummy will fight, but he will lose. Cultural dominance is reified in film artifact. In Hawaii, the politics of colonial anthropology and archaeology are not publicly debated, or even acknowledged by its practitioners in the university, or the museum, or the field, and certainly not in the contract firm. Because most archaeology in Hawaii is, quote, contract, end quote, archaeology, that is, archaeology done for hire to satisfy state or federal requirements, professional ethics often take a back seat to the demands of speedy development. Simply said, contract firms find that monetary self-interest requires that they discover no significant sites, especially religious sites, that might trigger statutory oversight and eventual protection. That these realities are an outgrowth of colonial domination is also ignored, or flat out denied, as are the political and ethical implications arising out of such origins. While thoughtful scholars and organizations in other places try to address their roles in dispossessing and further colonizing the people they study, anthropologists and archaeologists in Hawaii, most of whom are white American, refuse to see Hawaiians as a colonized people whose native land is a colonial possession of the United States. Worse, they avoid the simple observation that most, if not all, anthropology and archaeology in Hawaii is done by non-natives for non-natives. Indeed, I do not know of any published piece written by an anthropologist on Hawaii which questions the presence of anthropologists or archaeologists here, or challenges their assumed intention of, quote, scholarship, end quote, or analyzes the racist assumptions of foreigners who believe a few years training in an American university, or any other university, qualifies them to study, describe, and pass judgment upon Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian people. There is a singular lack of controversy here while a phalanx of academic colonizers prepares our burial grounds for development, characterizes our cultural beliefs as ideological inventions for political ends, and determines what is and who is Hawaiian. Despite raging battles in the Hawaiian community over disinterment of our ancestral bones, for example, Honokahua on Maui and the Pele Cave in Puna, the bombing of our sacred places, Kaho'olawe Island, Makua, Pohakuloa, industrial development of our forests and oceans, such as geothermal energy production and manganese nodule mining, resort development of our shorelines and valleys, which forecloses Hawaiian fishing and agricultural projects, for example, the West Beach Project on Oahu, and highway development of our valleys, H3 Freeway, anthropologists and archaeologists have vigorously resisted examining their work and its political impact as they aid state and private developers in transforming our lands and waters. They have run away from the accurate native accusation that their arguments are used by our colonizers. For example, the US military, the resort industry, the state government, and other anthropologists, in furthering our degradation, our suffering, and our powerlessness. When criticized by Hawaiians in struggle, their defense is a retreat into, quote, science, end quote, or, quote, scholarly endeavor, end quote, as if these projects have no historical contexts and are not themselves subject to error, racist intent, and political usage. Anthropologists and archaeologists have gone on the offensive, attacking natives who oppose them as, quote, ignorant about their culture, end quote, or, quote, romantic and mixed up, end quote. Here, the hidden racism of anthropology and archaeology is made manifest through native challenge. When push comes to shove, anthropologists and archaeologists say what they really think. They are the experts on native culture. They have superior knowledge of it. Natives, by comparison, are uninformed and untrained, and should not, therefore, have control over their sites and culture. In this political context, foreign, quote, experts, end quote, with their support of local and state government, including planning and other legal processes, are pitted against, quote, emotional, end quote, natives who have nothing to rely upon but their personal and cultural integrity in asserting that their sacred places and beloved lands must not be damaged. This situation is obviously colonial. The indigenous people, once rulers of their own destiny, are totally subjugated to the technocrats of another culture dedicated to endless profit on the ancestral birth sands of the native people. It is not merely that Hawaiians are institutionally powerless to decide how and whether their people and their cultural remains should be studied at all. It is that a whole way of life, of being in and with the world, has been obliterated. The destiny that is left to native people then becomes an imposed life of never-ending struggle in a losing war. The daily experience of resistance for Hawaiians is bitter indeed. When we challenge what experts say and write, we are attacked for not knowing what and who we are, for being grossly political, or for, quote, haole bashing, end quote. Because we are presumed to be inferior in terms of Western training and concepts, the public debate never approaches the issues, but always falls back on disparagement of our psychological state or our emotional and rational equilibrium. In other words, we are characterized in terms reserved for the infirm or the mentally incompetent. Many Hawaiians, myself included, have been branded as, quote, crazies, end quote, simply because we assert the priority of our cultural values. For example, that land is our ancestor and that burial grounds are sacred, over the American insistence that all value proceeds from money-making. In the Hawaiian way of thinking, a value that holds money and, quote, science, end quote, as the promise of human fulfillment is itself crazy. If this public disparagement does not stifle our resistance, then the counterattack becomes an economic one. Thus, there have been various attempts to have us fired from our jobs, or to prevent us from getting jobs, especially if they have some professional status that would challenge archaeologists and anthropologists. While Hawaiians suffer this colonial yoke, anthropologists deny the very methodology of their work as exploitative. To native peoples, anthropology is based on a peculiarly Western belief that studying books and learning to do field work bequeaths a right to go halfway around the world to live with, observe, and write about another people. Moreover, this exploitation of a people's hospitality and generosity does not carry with it any responsibility of repayment in kind, or of privilege and privacy. At some time in their professional lives, anthropologists live with natives who are in struggle, dispossessed, or in some cases endangered. But in the interests of knowledge or science or some other abstraction, the anthropologist has no obligation to aid the people he or she studies, to withhold information that threatens the people or is considered sacred or privileged to them, or to be a part of their struggles, whatever they may be. In other words, the anthropologist is a taker and a user. And if the people who are taken suffer from the anthropologist's work, too bad. No moral or ethical responsibility attaches to the anthropologist or the archaeologist. Familiar examples come from places where native peoples are being removed or killed at an incredible rate, such as the Amazon, or the Philippines, or tribal areas in India. But this colonial exploitation is also occurring right here and now in Hawaii. Jocelyn Linnekin, former student of Marshall Sahlins and a tenured professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Hawaiʻi, Mānoa, has written a book, Children of the Land, and an article, quote, defining tradition, variations on the Hawaiian identity, end quote, in which she asserts that the modern-day Hawaiians have, quote, invented, end quote, what they claim is a traditional value of love and caring for the land. She refers to this value, called aloha aina, or malama aina, as a, quote, slogan, end quote, rather than a real cultural value, that is used by the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana and other Hawaiian groups in their efforts to stop military bombing of Kaho'olawe. She goes on to say that the sacred meaning of Kaho'olawe was invented because Hawaiian nationalists needed a, quote, political and cultural symbol of protest, end quote, in the modern period. Despite 19th century evidence of Kaho'olawe's importance, Linnekin argues that the island's meaning has been created for the purposes of Hawaiian political maneuvering today. In her article, Linnekin writes, quote, for Hawaii, quote, traditional, end quote, properly refers to the pre-contact era, before Cook's arrival in 1778, end quote. But later, on the same page, she admits that, quote, tradition is fluid, end quote. Still, despite this confusion, she criticizes Hawaiians for a, quote, reconstruction of traditional Hawaiian society, end quote, in the present. Linnekin's difficulty stems from the kind of wrong-headedness that insists on hard-edged bifurcations of reality. Pre-Western culture versus post-Western culture. But what constitutes, quote, tradition, end quote, to a people is ever-changing. Culture is not static, nor is it frozen in objectified moments in time. Without doubt, Hawaiians were transformed drastically and irreparably after contact. But remnants of earlier life ways, including values and symbols, have persisted. One of these values is the Hawaiian responsibility to care for the land, to make it flourish, called Malama Aina or Aloha Aina. To Linnekin, this value has been invented by modern Hawaiians to protest degradation of the land by developers, the military, and others. What Linnekin has missed here, partly because she has an incomplete grasp of, quote, traditional, end quote, values, but also because she does not understand, and thus misapprehends Hawaiian cultural nationalism, is simply this. The Hawaiian relationship to land has persisted into the present. What has changed is ownership and use of the land, from collective use by Hawaiians for subsistence to private use by whites and other non-natives for profit. Asserting the Hawaiian relationship in this changed context results in politicization. Thus, Hawaiians assert a, quote, traditional, end quote, relationship to the land, not for political ends, as Linnekin argues, but because they continue to believe in the cultural value of caring for the land. That land use is now contested makes such a belief political. This distinction is crucial because the Hawaiian cultural motivation reveals the persistence of traditional values, the very thing Linnekin claims modern Hawaiians have, quote, invented, end quote. In her book, Linnekin severely criticizes Hawaiian nationalists, arguing that their nationalism is so much ideological fodder in the fight for land claims, while disparaging their cultural origins as something less than, quote, Hawaiian, end quote. She mistakenly says the Hawaiian movement is urban in origin and even misunderstands the lack of nationalism in other ethnic groups. Apart from the factual errors Linnekin has made, the movement is rural in origin, Aloha Aina is a traditional value, Hawaiians are nationalist and other ethnic groups are not because we are the only group in Hawaii to ever been made, literally nationless in the land of our own birth. Her position is that we have, quote, invented, end quote, our traditions has now been repeated by other anthropologists, such as the anti-native professor Roger Keesing, by newspapers such as the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle-Examiner, and worst of all for Hawaiians, by the U.S. Navy as justification for ongoing destruction of Hawaiian lands. In short, because Linnekin wanted to publish an allegedly scholarly article applying the, quote, inventing tradition, inventing culture, end quote, school of thought to Hawaiians, we, the native people, are now faced with a proliferating ideology that is hurting our real culture every day, hurting real Hawaiians every day, and that is being used over and over to undermine our claim to say who and what we are. Of course, Hawaiian nationalists' claim to knowledge is our life experiences as natives within a culture that is 2,000 years old. Linneken's claim to knowledge is her brief training, in Michigan, as an anthropologist. But the problem is more serious than epistemology. In a colonial world, the work of anthropologists and other Western-trained, quote, experts, end quote, is used to disparage and exploit natives. Thus, what Linneken writes about Hawaiians has more potential power than what Hawaiians write. Proof of this rests in the use of Linneken's argument by the U.S. Navy that Hawaiian nationalists have invented the sacred meaning of Kaho'olawe Island. Here, the connection between anthropology and the colonial enterprise is explicit. When natives accuse Western scholars of exploiting them, they have in mind the exact kind of situation I am describing. Beneath this academic reaction to native assertions of our own culture is the entire question of evidence. How could an obviously wrong-headed statement about Hawaiians inventing their love for the land become such an oft-repeated, quote, fact, end quote? The answer is simple. A different standard of proof operates when natives are involved. Every reiteration of the, quote, fact, end quote, of our cultural invention reinforces it as a truism. Because of deep-rooted racism at the core of Western history, negative descriptions are believed without the slightest shred of evidence because the people in question are natives. Were the same statements to be made about white people, careful examination of evidence and demands for more of it would be assumed. Not so with natives. I teach a course in Hawaiian Studies called, quote, Myths of Hawaiian History, end quote. I devised the course after concluding that so much of what passed for Hawaiian history was nothing more than a series of political myths created by foreigners and designed to disparage our people. Many of the myths, such as infanticide as a common practice in pre-Haole Hawaiian culture, were invented by missionaries. But what is perhaps more telling is that these same myths are repeated today by anthropologists and archaeologists. Thus, the, quote, great, end quote, Marshall Salins, like the less great Eleanor Nordyke and Gavin Dawes, asserts that Hawaiians practiced infanticide, but offers as evidence only doubtful missionary hearsay. The fashionable Valerio Valeri argues that Hawaiian land tenure was feudal, but his only evidence is alleged linguistic similarities between Hawaiian and European terms, hardly a sound evidentiary base. Patrick Kirch, a leading figure in Hawaiian archaeology, has written that tuberculosis was a, quote, common pathology, end quote, in pre-Haole Hawaii, which, in turn, is exaggerated by archaeologist Paul Klerghorn, who claims that, quote, many, end quote, Hawaiians suffered from it. At this writing, no evidence exists that there was any tuberculosis in pre-Haole Hawaii. And the list of lies told by credible professional academics about us native Hawaiians goes on and on. Indeed, it could be said that anthropologists and archaeologists are inventing our culture at an unbelievable rate. To bewildered non-natives, it may not be clear why we natives are so upset about all this, or even what infanticide, feudalism, and tuberculosis have in common as descriptions of pre-Haole Hawaiian society. Suffice it to say that these fabrications, when taken together, form a tidy racist profile of a people who, in Western thinking, are primitive, because they practice baby killing, backward, because they have feudal land tenure, and diseased. The value of this description, although false, is simply that Western impact is then seen to be beneficial for Hawaiians, since it meant an end to infanticide, the liberation of private property, and the excusing of diseased Westerners, such as the celebrated Captain Cook, and the resulting massive depopulation of Hawaiians. I could go on with this list, which also includes other myths and other inventors from fields such as history, demography, and politics. But the point has been made. When it comes to natives, negative statements are eagerly believed with but the thinnest evidence or none at all, because of the general racist belief in native cultural and physical inferiority. As a Native Hawaiian who has participated for nearly 15 years in the current efforts of my people to sustain their peoplehood and nationhood, I have fought with anthropologists and archaeologists many times. To stop disinterment, to insist on accurate representation of the Hawaiian movement, to end osteological and DNA analysis. At each juncture, I feel that we Hawaiians have no likelihood of convincing either the anthropologists or the archaeologists of our position. They seem, almost to a person, to reject our arguments against, quote, scientific, end quote, study, so-called cultural analysis, and all the rest. Worse, some of them have tried to injure our employment opportunities, to question our motives and our sanity, even to assert that they are themselves native to Hawaii. All this has brought me to the following position. First, all anthropology and archaeology on Hawaiians should stop. There should be a moratorium on studying, unearthing, slicing, crushing, and analyzing us. Second, while this moratorium is in place, there needs to be serious discussion among anthropologists and archaeologists about their political roles, their place in Hawaii, and their responsibility to the Hawaiian people. Some departure points here could be the kind of ethical discussions that take place among atomic scientists and geneticists regarding the potential damage of their work to other people. This is especially true of work on the contemporary Hawaiian movement that is used daily by our enemies to disparage and attack us. In other words, there needs to be some internal discussion among anthropologists and archaeologists about the impact of their work on living Hawaiians and the ethical conflicts that spring from their research. There needs to be an equal discussion between these two groups and leaders in the Hawaiian community. Third, Hawaiians must lead an independent, professional investigation into the Bishop Museum, the largest and oldest research museum focusing on the Pacific Islands, with particular interest in traditional Hawaiian culture. Serious questions remain concerning the quality and professional integrity of their contract archaeology, including questions of falsification of reporting on sites and mismanagement of state funds. In the last 10 years, Bishop Museum has come under increasing fire from the Hawaiian community, practicing archaeologists, and other state agencies for shoddy work and an arrogant disregard of Hawaiian cultural expertise in identifying religious sites. Fourth, anthropologists and archaeologists working in Hawaii need to acknowledge and address the racist inheritance of their fields, as well as their own individual prejudices against the native culture and people classified by Euro-American, quote, civilization, end quote, as inferior and savage. For many Hawaiians, including myself, archaeologists who dig up our ancestors for money or glory are maha'oi haole. That is, rude and intrusive white people who go where they do not belong. It is simply wrong, culturally, for non-natives to dig up our ancestors, to break their bones, to remove them for highways and hotels, and to publish about them. Unlike white people, our culture is not obsessed with, quote, scientific, end quote, study of human skeletons. We have much aloha for our ancestors and think of their burials as worthy of both ceremony and respect. This is why many of us Hawaiians do not support disinterment and analysis of our ancestral remains. I cannot reconcile grave robbing of my own people to increase, quote, scientific, end quote, knowledge. Some things are sacred, even though, to the West, nothing is. To me, and to most natives, bones, graves, and rituals are sacrosanct. No exceptions. For those who know little about such things outside Hawaii, let me just say that in the Maori and Aboriginal situations, in my understanding, the native peoples exert much more control over what and how work is done regarding their culture and their artifacts. And in entirely independent countries, the native people decide everything. Period. In this, as in so much else, Hawaii is far behind other Pacific nations. Finally, I reiterate something all colonialists despise. Native land belongs to native people. They are the only residents with a genealogical claim to their place. That Euro-Americans violently disagree with this does not make it less true. Indeed, violent disagreement is violent precisely to the degree that the presence of Euro-Americans is dominant. In the Americas, white people insist on the fiction of, quote, discovery, end quote, of two continents where more than 150 million people lived at the time of conquest. The genocide that followed contact continues today, but that too is a story of denial. In Hawaii, Hawaiians are categorized as just another group of immigrants who happened along some 2,000 years ago before whites and Asians. Words like, quote, indigenous, end quote, are never used by scholars or laypeople to describe Hawaiians. Nor is the word, quote, settler, end quote, used to describe immigrants. As racist as this obviously is, the denial of native history, culture, and humanity is central to the colonial endeavor. Archaeology and anthropology, in Hawaii as elsewhere, are integral parts of the mammoth Euro-American project to dominate the human and natural world. For those who disagree, there is really no middle ground. Non-natives, no matter how long their residence in Hawaii, should acknowledge their status as settlers, that is, uninvited guests in our native country. Hawaiians are the only native people. No other people, Asian, white, etc., can or should claim native status. Put differently, we are not all immigrants. Therefore, those who are native Hawaiians have the only honest claim to decide what is researched and published about us and what is kapu, sacred. This is my challenge and hope. Quote, lovely hula hands, end quote. Corporate tourism and the prostitution of Hawaiian culture. I am certain that most, if not all, Americans have heard of Hawaii and have wished, at some point in their lives, to visit my native land. But I doubt that the history of how Hawaii came to be territorially incorporated and economically, politically, and culturally subordinated to the United States is known to most Americans. Nor is it common knowledge that Hawaiians have been struggling for over 20 years to achieve a land base and some form of political sovereignty on the same level as American Indians. Finally, I would imagine that most Americans could not place Hawaii or any other Pacific island on a map of the Pacific. But despite all this appalling ignorance, 5 million Americans will vacation in my homeland this year and the next, and so on, into the foreseeable capitalist future. Such are the intended privileges of the so-called American standard of living. Ignorance of, and yet power over, one's relations to native peoples. Thanks to post-war American imperialism, the ideology that the United States has no overseas colonies and is, in fact, the champion of self-determination the world over, holds no greater sway than in the United States itself. To most Americans, then, Hawaii is theirs, to use, to take, and, above all, to fantasize about long after the experience. Just 5 hours away by plane from California, Hawaii is 1,000 light-years away in fantasy. Mostly a state of mind, Hawaii is the image of escape from the rawness and violence of daily American life. Hawaii, the word, the vision, the sound, and the mind, is the fragrance and feel of soft kindness. Above all, Hawaii is, quote, she, end quote, the Western image of the native, quote, female, end quote, in her magical allure. And, if luck prevails, some of, quote, her, end quote, will rub off on you, the visitor. This fictional Hawaii comes out of the depths of Western sexual sickness that demands a dark, sin-free native for instant gratification between imperialist wars. The attraction of Hawaii is stimulated by slick Hollywood movies, saccharine Andy Williams music, and the constant psychological deprivations of maniacal American life. Tourists flock to my native land for escape, but they are escaping into a state of mind while participating in the destruction of a host people in a native place. To Hawaiians, daily life is neither soft nor kind. In fact, the political, economic, and cultural reality for most Hawaiians is hard, ugly, and cruel. In Hawaii, the destruction of our land and the prostitution of our culture is planned and executed by multinational corporations, both foreign-based and Hawaii-based, by huge landowners, such as the missionary-descended Castle and Cook of Dole pineapple fame, and by collaborationist state and county governments. The ideological gloss that claims tourism to be our economic savior and the quote natural end quote result of Hawaiian culture is manufactured by ad agencies, such as the state-supported Hawaii Visitors Bureau, and tour companies, many of which are owned by the airlines, and spewed out to the public through complicitous cultural engines such as film, television and radio, and the daily newspaper. As for the local labor unions, both rank and file and management clamor for more tourists, while the construction industry lobbies incessantly for larger resorts. The major public educational institution, the University of Hawaiʻi, funnels millions of taxpayer dollars into a school of travel industry management and a business school replete with a real estate center and a chair of free enterprise, renamed the Walker Chair to hide the crude reality of capitalism. As the propaganda arm of the tourist industry in Hawaii, both schools churn out studies that purport to show why Hawaii needs more golf courses, hotels, and tourist infrastructure, and how Hawaiian culture is, quote, naturally, end quote, one of giving and entertaining. Of course, state-encouraged commodification and prostitution of native cultures through tourism is not unique to Hawaii. It is suffered by peoples in places as disparate as Goa, Australia, Tahiti, and the southwestern United States. Indeed, the problem is so commonplace that international organizations, for example, the Ecumenical Coalition on Third World Tourism out of Bangkok, the Center for Responsible Tourism in California, and the Third World European Network, have banded together to give voice to native peoples in daily resistance against corporate tourism. My focus on Hawaii, although specific to my own culture, would likely transfer well when applied to most native peoples. Despite our similarities with other major tourist destinations, the statistical picture of the effects of corporate tourism in Hawaii is shocking. Fact: nearly 40 years ago, at statehood, Hawaii residents outnumbered tourists by more than 2 to 1. Today, tourists outnumber residents by 6 to 1. They outnumber native Hawaiians by 30 to 1. Fact: according to independent economists and criminologists, quote, tourism has been the single most powerful factor in Oahu's crime rate, end quote, including crimes against people and property. Fact: independent demographers have been pointing out for years that, quote, tourism is the major source of population growth in Hawaii, end quote, and that, quote, rapid growth of the tourist industry ensures the trend toward a rapidly expanded population that receives lower per capita income, end quote. Fact: the Bank of Hawaii has reported that the average real incomes of Hawaii residents grew only 1% during the period from the early 70s through the early 80s, when tourism was booming. The same held true throughout the 90s. The Census Bureau reports that personal income growth in Hawaii during the same time was the lowest by far of any of the 50 American states. Fact: groundwater supplies on Oahu will be insufficient to meet the needs of residents and tourists by the year 2000. Fact: according to the Honolulu Advertiser, quote, Japanese investors have spent more than $7.1 billion on their acquisitions, end quote, since 1986 in Hawaii. This kind of volume translates into huge alienations of land and properties. For example, nearly 2,000 acres of land on the Big Island of Hawaii was purchased for $18.5 million, and over 7,000 acres on Molokai went for $33 million. In 1989, over $1 billion was spent by the Japanese on land alone. Fact: More plants and animals from our Hawaiian Islands are now extinct or on the endangered species list than in the rest of the United States. Fact: more than 29,000 families are on the Hawaiian Trust Lands list, waiting for housing, pastoral, or agricultural lots. Fact: the median cost of a home on the most populated island of Oahu is around $350,000. Fact: Hawaii has by far the worst ratio of average family income to average housing costs in the country. This explains why families spend nearly 52% of their gross income for housing costs. Fact: nearly 1/5 of Hawaii's resident population is classified as near homeless. That is, those for whom any mishap results in immediate, on-the-street homelessness. These kinds of statistics render a very bleak picture, not at all what the posters and jingoistic tourist promoters would have you believe about Hawaii. My use of the word tourism in the Hawaii context refers to a mass-based, corporately controlled industry that is both vertically and horizontally integrated such that one multinational corporation owns an airline and the tour buses that transport tourists to the corporation-owned hotel, where they eat in a corporation-owned restaurant, play golf and, quote, experience, end quote, Hawaii on corporation-owned recreation areas, and eventually consider buying a second home built on corporation land. Profits, in this case, are mostly repatriated back to the home country. In Hawaii, these, quote, home, end quote, countries are Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Canada, Australia, and the United States. In this sense, Hawaii is very much like a third world colony where the local elite, the Democratic Party in our state, collaborate in the rape of native land and people. The mass nature of this kind of tourism results in mega-resort complexes on thousands of acres with demands for water and services that far surpass the needs of Hawaii residents. These complexes may boast several hotels, golf courses, restaurants, and other, quote, necessaries, end quote, to complete the total tourist experience. Infrastructure is usually built by the developer in exchange for county approval of more hotel units. In Hawaii, counties bid against each other to attract larger and larger complexes. Quote, rich, end quote, counties, then, are those with more resorts, since they will pay more of the tax base of that county. The richest of these is the city and county of Honolulu, which encompasses the entire island of Oahu. This island is the site of 4 major tourist destinations, a major international airport, and 80% of the resident population of Hawaii. The military also controls nearly 30% of the island, with bases and airports of their own. As you might imagine, the density of certain parts of Honolulu, e.g. Waikiki, is among the highest in the world. At the present annual visitor count, more than 5 million tourists pour through Oahu, an island of only 607 square miles. With this as a background on tourism, I want to move now into the area of cultural prostitution. Prostitution in this context refers to the entire institution that defines a woman, and by extension the female, as an object of degraded and victimized sexual value for use and exchange through the medium of money. The prostitute is a woman who sells her sexual capacities and is seen, thereby, to possess and reproduce them at will. That is, by her very, quote, nature, end quote. The prostitute and the institution that creates and maintains her are, of course, of patriarchal origin. The pimp is the conduit of exchange, managing the commodity that is the prostitute while acting as the guard at the entry and exit gates, making sure that the prostitute behaves as a prostitute by fulfilling her sexual economic functions. The victims participate in their victimization with enormous ranges of feeling, from resistance to complicity, but the force and continuity of the institution are shaped by men. There's much more to prostitution than my sketch reveals, but this must suffice, for I am interested in using the largest sense of this term as a metaphor in understanding what has happened to Hawaiian culture. My purpose is not to exact detail or fashion a model, but to convey the utter degradation of our culture and our people under corporate tourism by employing prostitution as an analytic category. Finally, I have chosen 4 areas of Hawaiian culture to examine: our homeland, our Onehano, that is Hawaii, our lands and fisheries, the outlying seas and the heavens, our language and dance, our familial relationships, and our woman. The mo'olelo, or history of Hawaiians, is to be found in our genealogies. From our great cosmogenic genealogy, the Kumulipo derives the Hawaiian identity. The, quote, essential lesson, end quote, of this genealogy is, quote, the interrelatedness of the Hawaiian world and the inseparability of its constituent parts, end quote. Thus, quote, the genealogy of the land, the gods, chiefs, and people intertwine one with the other, and with all aspects of the universe, end quote. In the mo'olelo of Papa and Wakea, quote, Earth Mother, end quote, and, quote, Sky Father, end quote, our islands were born: Hawaii, Maui, Oahu, Kauai, and Ni'ihau. From their human offspring came the taro plant, and from the taro came the Hawaiian people. The lessons of our genealogy are that human beings have a familiar relationship to the land and to the taro, our elder sibling, or kua'ana. In Hawaii, as in all of Polynesia, younger siblings must serve and honor elder siblings, who, in turn, must feed and care for their younger siblings. Therefore, Hawaiians must cultivate and husband the land that will feed and provide for the Hawaiian people. This relationship of people to the land is called malama aina, or aloha aina, quote, care and love of the land, end quote. When people and land work together harmoniously, the balance that results is called pono. In Hawaiian society, the ali'i, or, quote, chiefs, end quote, were required to maintain order, an abundance of food, and good government. The maka'ainana, or, quote, common people, end quote, worked the land and fed the chiefs. The ali'i organized production and appeased the gods. Today, malama aina is called stewardship by some, although that word does not convey spiritual and genealogical connections. Nevertheless, to love and make the land flourish is a Hawaiian value. Aina, one of the words for land, means, quote, that which feeds, end quote. Kama'aina, a term for native-born people, means, quote, child of the land, end quote. Thus is the Hawaiian relationship to land both familial and reciprocal. Hawaiian deities also spring from the land. Pele is our volcano, Kane and Lono are fertile valleys and plains, Kanaloa our ocean and all that lives within it, and so on, with the numerous gods of Hawaii. Our whole universe, physical and metaphysical, is divine. Within this world, the older people, or kupuna, are to cherish those who are younger, the mo'opuna. Unstinting generosity is a prized value. Social connections between our people are through aloha, simply translated as, quote, love, but carrying with it a profoundly Hawaiian sense that is, again, familial and genealogical. Hawaiians feel aloha for Hawaii from whence they come, and for their Hawaiian kin upon whom they depend. It is nearly impossible to feel or practice aloha for something that is not familial. This is why we extend familial relations to those few non-natives whom we feel understand and can reciprocate our aloha. But aloha is freely given and freely returned. It is not and cannot be demanded or commanded. Above all, aloha is a cultural feeling and practice that works among the people and between the people and their land. The significance and meaning of aloha underscores the centrality of the Hawaiian language, or olelo, to the culture. Olelo means both, quote, language, end quote, and, quote, tongue, end quote. Mo'olelo, or, quote, history, end quote, is that which comes from the tongue, that is, quote, a story, end quote. Haole, or white people, say that we have oral history, but what we have are stories, such as our creation story, passed on through the generations. This sense of history is different from the Haole sense of history. To Hawaiians in traditional society, language had tremendous power, thus the phrase, "Ika ole loke ola, ika ole loka make." Quote, "In language is life, in language is death," end quote. After nearly 2,000 years of speaking Hawaiian, our people suffered the near extinction of our language through its banning by the American-imposed government in 1900, the year Hawaii became a territory of the United States. All schools, government operations, and official transactions were thereafter conducted in English, despite the fact that most people, including non-natives, still spoke Hawaiian at the turn of the century. Since 1970, Ōlelo Hawaii, or the Hawaiian language, has undergone a tremendous revival, including the rise of language immersion schools. The state of Hawaii now has 2 official languages, Hawaiian and English, and the call for Hawaiian language speakers and teachers is increasing every day. Along with the flowering of Hawaiian language has come a flowering of Hawaiian dance, especially in its ancient form, called hula kahiko. Dance academies, known as halau, have proliferated through Hawaii, as have kumuhula, or dance masters, and formal competitions where all-night presentations continue for 3 or 4 days to throngs of appreciative listeners. Indeed, among Pacific Islanders, Hawaiian dance is considered one of the finest Polynesian art forms today. Of course, the cultural revitalization that Hawaiians are now experiencing and transmitting to their children is as much a repudiation of colonization by so-called Western civilization in its American form, as it is a reclamation of our own past and our own ways of life. This is why cultural revitalization is often resisted and disparaged by anthropologists and others. They see very clearly that its political effect is decolonization of the mind. Thus, our rejection of the nuclear family as the basic unit of society and of individualism as the best form of human expression infuriates social workers, the churches, the legal system, and educators to this day. Hawaiians continue to have allegedly, quote, illegitimate, end quote, children, to hanai, or, quote, adopt, end quote, both children and adults outside of sanctioned Western legal concepts, to hold and use land and water in a collective form rather than a private property form, and to prescribe the notion and the value that one person should strive to surpass and therefore outshine all others. All these Hawaiian values can be grouped under the idea of ohana, loosely translated as, quote, family, end quote, but more accurately imagined as a group of both closely and distantly related people who share nearly everything, from land and food to children and status. Sharing is central to this value, since it prevents individual decline. Of course, poverty is not thereby avoided, it is only shared with everyone in the unit. The ohana works effectively when the kua'ana relationship, elder sibling-younger sibling reciprocity, is practiced. Finally, within the ohana, our women are considered the life-givers of the nation and are accorded the respect and honor this status conveys. Our young women, like our young people in general, are the pua, or, quote, flower, end quote, of our lahui, or our, quote, nation, end quote. The renowned beauty of our women, especially their sexual beauty, is not considered a commodity to be hoarded by fathers and brothers, but an attribute of our people. Culturally, Hawaiians are very open and free about sexual relationships, although Christianity and organized religion have done much to damage these traditional sexual values. With this understanding of what it means to be Hawaiian, I want to move now to the prostitution of our culture by tourism. Hawaii itself is the female object of degraded and victimized sexual value. Our aina, or lands, are not any longer the source of food and shelter, but the source of money. Land is now called, quote, real estate, end quote, rather than, quote, our mother, end quote, papa. The American relationship of people to land is that of exploiter to exploited. Beautiful areas, once sacred to my people, are now expensive resorts, Shorelines where net fishing, seaweed gathering, and crabbing occurred are more and more the exclusive domain of recreational activities such as sunbathing, windsurfing, and jet skiing. Now, even access to beaches near hotels is strictly regulated or denied to the local public altogether. The phrase, malama aina, quote, to care for the land, end quote, is used by government officials to sell new projects and to convince the locals that hotels can be built with a concern for, quote, ecology, end quote. Hotel historians, like hotel doctors, are stationed in-house to soothe the visitor's stay with the pablum of invented myths and tales of the, quote, primitive, end quote. High schools and hotels adopt each other and funnel teenagers through major resorts for guided tours, from kitchens to gardens to honeymoon suites, in preparation for post-secondary school jobs in the lowest paid industry in the state. In the meantime, tourist appreciation kits and movies are distributed through the State Department of Education to all elementary schools. One film, unashamedly titled What's in It for Me, was devised to convince locals that tourism is, as the newspapers never tire of saying, quote, the only game in town, end quote. Of course, all this hype is necessary to hide the truth about tourism, the awful exploitative truth that the industry is the major cause of environmental degradation, low wages, land dispossession, and the highest cost of living in the United States. While this propaganda is churned out to local residents, the commercialization of Hawaiian culture proceeds with calls for more sensitive marketing of our native values and practices. After all, a prostitute is only as good as her income-producing talents. These talents, in Hawaiian terms, are the hula, the generosity, or aloha, of our people, the u'i, or youthful beauty, of our women and men, and the continuing allure of our lands and waters, that is, of our place, Hawaii. The selling of these talents must produce income, and the function of tourism in the state of Hawaii is to convert these attributes into profit. The first requirement is the transformation of the product, or the cultural attribute, much as a woman must be transformed to look like a prostitute. That is, someone who is complicitous in her own commodification. Thus, hula dancers wear clown-like makeup, don costumes from a mix of Polynesian cultures, and behave in a manner that is smutty and salacious rather than powerfully erotic. The distance between the smutty and the erotic is precisely the distance between Western culture and Hawaiian culture. In the hotel version of the hula, the sacredness of the dance has completely evaporated, while the athleticism and sexual expression have been packaged like ornaments. The purpose is entertainment for profit rather than a joyful and truly Hawaiian celebration of human and divine nature. The point, of course, is that everything in Hawaii can be yours. That is, you, the tourists, the non-natives, the visitors. The place, the people, the culture, even our identity as a, quote, native, end quote, people, is for sale. Thus, the word, quote, aloha, end quote, is employed as an aid in the constant hawking of things Hawaiian. In truth, this use of aloha is so far removed from any Hawaiian cultural context that it is, literally, meaningless. Thus, Hawaii, like a lovely woman, is there for the taking. Those with only a little money get a brief encounter, those with a lot of money, like the Japanese, get more. The state and counties will give tax breaks, build infrastructure, and have the governor personally welcome tourists to ensure that they keep coming. Just as the pimp regulates prices and guards the commodity of the prostitute, so the state bargains with developers for access to Hawaiian land and culture. Who builds the biggest resorts to attract the most affluent tourists gets the best deal. More hotel rooms, golf courses, and restaurants approved. Permits are fast-tracked, height and density limits are suspended, new groundwater sources are miraculously found. Hawaiians, meanwhile, have little choice in all this. We can fill up the unemployment lines, enter the military, work in the tourist industry, or leave Hawaii. Increasingly, Hawaiians are leaving, not by choice, but out of economic necessity. Our people who work in the industry, dancers, waiters, singers, valets, gardeners, housekeepers, bartenders, and even a few managers, make between $10,000 and $25,000 a year, an impossible salary for a family in Hawaii. Psychologically, our young people have begun to think of tourism as the only employment opportunity, trapped as they are by the lack of alternatives. For our young women, modeling is a quote cleaner end quote job when compared to waiting on tables or dancing in a weekly review, but modeling feeds on tourism and the commodification of Hawaiian women. In the end, the entire employment scene is shaped by tourism. Despite their exploitation, Hawaiians' participation in tourism raises the problem of complicity. Because wages are so low and advancement so rare, whatever complicity exists is secondary to the economic hopelessness that drives Hawaiians into the industry. Refusing to contribute to the commercialization of one's culture becomes a peripheral concern when unemployment looms. Of course, many Hawaiians do not see tourism as part of their colonization. Thus, tourism is viewed as providing jobs, not as a form of cultural prostitution. Even those who have some glimmer of critical consciousness do not generally agree that the tourist industry prostitutes Hawaiian culture. This is a measure of the depth of our mental oppression. We cannot understand our own cultural degradation because we are living it. As colonized people, we are colonized to the extent that we are unaware of our oppression. When awareness begins, then so too does decolonization. Judging by the growing resistance to new hotels, to geothermal energy, and manganese nodule mining, which would supplement the tourist industry, and to increases in the sheer number of tourists, I would say that decolonization has begun. But we have many more stages to negotiate on our path to sovereignty. My brief excursion into the prostitution of Hawaiian culture has done no more than give an overview. Now that you have read A Native View, let me just leave this thought with you. If you are thinking of visiting my homeland, please do not. We do not want or need any more tourists, and we certainly do not like them. If you want to help our cause, pass this message on to your friends.